So about Brad Wetzler, have you ever wanted to travel the world or go surfing with Christian cult leaders in Indonesia, walk the Jesus Trail from Nazareth to Capernaum along the Sea of Galilee, have a spiritual awakening while on a meditation retreat in India, and then call it all work? Well, that's what Brad Wetzler has done in his career. He's an award-winning travel writer, former editor of Outside Magazine, and he's traveled the world capturing stories of adventure and faith for publications like the New York Times, Newsweek, Men's Journal, Travel and Leisure, Wired, GQ, and more. And right now he's been teaching a series of workshops on memoir and travel writing. And he is working on a book called Chasing Jesus, Finding God. So I'm going to open this up to Brad, and he's going to talk to us about his experiences with faith, wonder, and love.
Great. Thank you, Erica. I was thinking about how to prepare today, and I thought since I'm primarily a storyteller, I'd tell a story, and then I'd be happy to talk about things afterwards. So let's begin here. At the age of 12, I had a brush with death that changed me. On the first day of a weekend father-son canoe trip in the Ozarks, the canoe carrying my dad and I capsized, and we were both sent overboard into the cold, fast-moving water. In the chaotic next seconds, my life jacket snagged on a submerged tree, and I was trapped there. Though my mouth remained above water, the rest of me felt the fury of thousands of gallons of water running through a narrow channel. The upriver current flung my torso violently into the log at the same time that the downriver current seemed to claw at my spindly limbs, enticing me to be free. I was terrified, and for 10 minutes I believed I would die. Because of the way my life jacket cradled my head, all I could do was stare at the wide blue sky. At first I screamed, then I raged, then I stopped. I prayed, and I bargained at the same time. God, I'll do anything you ask me if you save me. After 10 minutes, I heard a loud crash, and I was surprised to find myself floating down the river. A friend and his dad had seen me struggling in the middle, and they'd rammed their canoe into the submerged log, setting me free. As I floated downriver, head still cradled by the life jacket, I felt free. Of what? Everything. I felt a sense of inner peace so deep, so calm. I'm not sure I ever felt that way again. Now I see how this event changed me in more ways than that boy could understand. Yes, it shook my sense of safety in nature, but it also instilled in me at a very young age a deep knowing. A knowing of how temporary this life is, and a knowing much deeper. During that traumatic event, I discovered within me a place that was both quiet and immense, maybe infinitely huge. In yoga philosophy, we say the microcosm is the macrocosm. What's inside of us is the full universe, God. And what's out there, it's in here too. That boy I was then trusted this deep place of knowing. It was real, more real than anything I'd ever experienced, more real than my own body, my mind, or any rock or tree in the physical world. After this near drowning, I became a deeply spiritual preteen. I latched on to Christianity, the dominant faith of my Kansas home. My deep faith in Jesus gave me something to hold on to that felt solid. Later, as a teenager, my faith helped me as I struggled to understand my father's drinking and my parents' marital struggles. And ultimately, I came to see the near drowning as a gift. The river shook me awake. It taught me to see that so many things we humans do and think are really not very important. It oriented me toward depth and authenticity, and it made me a seeker. It probably also had something to do with the arrival at age 14 of what I call my little mystical experiences. During frequent fleeting episodes, I'd become overwhelmed by strong feelings of merging with the universe. I was in love with everything. And then I lost it. I went away to college. I got busy afterward trying to become a famous writer. And then I began to struggle with bouts of depression. And during those dark times, I'd connect mentally with these past strong feelings of absolute love. I couldn't feel it then, but I did remember it. And those memories kept me going. And then this happened. Years passed. And then a few years ago, I traveled to India for a 2-week retreat at an ashram near a Hindu temple built by a famous spiritual teacher named Neem Karoli Baba. He taught that the only thing in life that mattered was love. And on that trip, I was shaken awake again, this time by the river of love. This story begins in a fast-moving Land Rover on a narrow and very busy two-lane road outside the village of Ramgarh in northern India's jungly Comoran hills. As we rounded a corner and forged up a hill, I was surprised to see a large monkey drop from a tree onto the road directly in our path. It appeared that the 3-foot-tall humanoid's life would end with a swift, violent ride on our Land Rover's front bumper. But first, he and I were destined to share a moment of intimacy. He seemed to look through the windshield at me at the same time that I gazed into his eyes. And then, thank God, he was gone. With no time to spare and with a fierce power that humans don't have, it leaped skyward. Its right hand grabbed a low-hanging branch and he flung himself like a circus acrobat up into the canopy. The entire incident lasted less than 2 seconds, but for the next several days I couldn't shake the image. The monkey's power, but also the weirdly fleeting but intimate connection I seemed to have with him. I was still thinking about this monkey as I and 5 friends hiked up a steep mountain trail en route to a cave where our leader, Narendra, said that a 99-year-old yogi named Babaji lived. I later learned that the monkey was a langur, also known as a Hanuman monkey, named after the Hindu monkey god whose devotion to service and his own godliness has been likened to Christ. After a hour-long hike, Narendra clanged a bell to mark our arrival. One by one, we crawled through the entrance. As soon as I was inside the dim candlelit room, I knew I'd entered an extraordinary new world. Sitting on a cushion in front of me, an ancient-looking man with a long orange-white beard and a dark, watery eyes tended to a small fire, stirring an open pot of tea. I watched my friends take turns bowing at the yogi's feet, and then it was my turn. I approached Babaji, noticing his gnarled hands and wrinkled face, and then I looked into his eyes. He looked into mine, and for 5 seconds I held my gaze, not wanting to break it. And then I bowed. My hands rested on his feet. My forehead touched the dirt floor. I'd never visited a yogi in a cave before, and while bowing to a stranger felt new, I also felt like I was somewhere near home, and I didn't want it to end. The extraordinary scene, combined with this particular moment in my life, made this moment feel extraordinary and profound. And then as I was about to rise up and crawl away to take a seat, whack, I felt his hard palm smack the crown of my head. It stunned me. I rose to my knees, crawled a few feet away, and took a cross-legged seat. Tears poured out of my eyes and down my face. 20 minutes later, I was still weeping. I couldn't escape a deep-seated feeling that I'd arrived, that I was home. Strange, since I was 8,000 miles from my Colorado home. Stranger still that I was sitting on the floor of a Himalayan cave in the presence of a man I'd never laid eyes on before. Eventually, the crying ceased. I settled down and drank tea and ate nuts with my friends. He invited us to ask questions, and we Americans took turns with the big questions we hoped a yogi might help us with. Katie asked about her recently deceased mother. Juan asked if he should stop drinking. Somebody else asked how to deal with difficult people and how does one live a good life. Babaji answered in long sentences in Hindi and Narendra translated. His answers seemed profound and wise, and afterward we chanted together to Hindu gods, and then we said goodbye and took a group photo. We all crawled back out into the sunlight and began the hour-long hike back down the mountain to our waiting Land Rover. On my way out, he tugged on my sleeve, Babaji did. He spoke. I looked at the translator, and he said, "Come back." That evening, I skipped dinner at the ashram. I sat in bed scratching my head, and then I fell into a deep sleep. I woke before dawn and dressed in the dark. I walked the garden path to the kitchen house where I poured myself a cup of chai. I sat in a chair by a table on a high patio overlooking the valley. Writing in my journal by flashlight, I watched the horizon for sunrise, and between scrawls, I took little sips of the hot, sweet tea. As the first morning light ignited the steep green mountain slopes, I spotted 2 yellow-green birds way out there above the valley floor. They flew the most elaborate and interesting looping flight pattern. They flew out, 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 and before they reached the opposite slope, they made several tight loop-de-loops, and then they headed back. They got close enough to almost touch, and before headed back out. I watched mesmerized as they repeated this flight path 6 or 7 times. I wondered if their skywriting formed a message for me. And then they disappeared. Disappointed, I stood and walked toward the kitchen in the quest of another cup of chai. I stumbled. I caught myself and I tried to take another step, but I could barely stay upright. My feet felt too heavy to lift. I must be getting sick, I thought. I set my chai down on a table and stumbled through the garden toward my room. Barely a foot in front of me, a large garden snake crossed the path. But something was very strange about this snake because in its wake, the ground squiggled and vibrated. Scratching my head, I looked toward the mountaintops across the valley. The edge of the dark green peaks blurred into the blue sky. The whole valley vibrated. Back in my room, my girlfriend lay awake. I told her about the birds and my heavy legs and the snake and the vibrating ground. I felt paranoid. I think somebody slipped me acid, I said. I was grasping for an explanation. I don't know. Tell me more, she said. I'm tripping my balls off. The mountain and sky are blended together. The earth is vibrating. I just saw a snake and it made the earth squiggle like its body. What's wrong with me? I felt scared and I began to cry. I don't know what's happening. It's too big to describe. Sweetie, you have to keep walking. I want to find those birds again. It's like they cast a spell on me. I walked out of the room and returned to my bird watching perch, but the birds were gone. The sun was up and the entire valley appeared wrapped in gauze. A wave of emotion rose from my belly, passed up my torso into my neck and head, and I burst into tears again. I don't use drugs, but I'd taken psychedelics a few times in the past, so I knew what tripping felt like. I'd also reached mildly altered states through meditation and yoga, but I definitely wasn't taking drugs that day. Yet I was completely out of my mind. Inside my skull, I soared like the birds I'd seen. A voice kept repeating the phrase, "It really is all one." This altered state of consciousness lasted all morning, and then it lasted all afternoon. I sat in wonder, I wept, and then as the sun set and the valley filled with shadows, my wild ride subsided. I eased back down, and again I was the man I knew myself to be. Weeks later, back in Boulder, Colorado, the trippy feelings returned a few times, usually during pre-dawn walks. These trips were far less extreme, but I couldn't definitely taste the edge of the altered state. I'm familiar with yogic terms Shaktipat and Samadhi. I've researched Western explanations of altered states of consciousness. I recently reread William James' A Variety of Religious Experience. I have plenty of rational tools to make sense of this experience, and frankly, all that stuff is worthless to me. I simply do not care to hear what anybody else says or thinks about my wild ride in India. The experience was more real to me than a morning spent at home reading the newspaper or a dinner out with friends. I will say this. I've spent most of my lifetime seeking answers, small and large. As a journalist, I asked politicians hard questions. As a spiritual seeker, I've sought ecstasy in desert ruins and mountain temples. Last October's mystical experience raises more questions than it answers, and I know this. I was blessed with a glimpse of it all, 8 hours worth. I'll remember that day as long as I live. I was given a glimpse of who we all are, underneath our fears and petty worries. Call me a silly man, but I have proof that we are wholly and fully healed. At the same time, we are flawed and human. Thank you.
Oh, wow. 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 Oh my God. Wow. Thank you for sharing. Erica, please unmute yourself.
It's so funny. I just had gotten a message from Tracy. She's like, how does anyone follow this? It's so beautiful.
Thank you for listening. It's such a powerful, meaningful experience, and clearly I'm still shaken by it, and in sense of beauty. I mean, just blows me away still.
Thank you. Thank you for being.
Describe your faith, Brad, in just a sentence. What would you say?
We asked that again. I missed the first part, Erica.
If you could describe your faith in one sentence, what would you say?
I would say it's trust and a deep knowing, and that sense of that place inside that is immense and real, and more real than anything else I know. So yeah.
That was really beautiful.
Thank you.
Before we move on, does anyone have any questions for Brad?
Might be best if they put it in the chat. It's going to be hard to see everybody at the same time. But certainly we feel it. And I think everyone's going to be processing the talk the rest of the day.
Thank you, both you, Erica and Jeff. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So Dakota, you're going to have the